This is the evening called Compatibility Matters. It's a presentation of Portland Together, which is a joint project of our Portland Coalition plus United Neighborhoods for Reform, the Architectural Heritage Center, and Restore Oregon. Our thanks especially to the AHC for their logistical support and registration services, and to Restore Oregon for a very generous financial donation. I'll be the moderator for this discussion tonight, but in a moment, and I'll introduce our speakers and panelists, but I'd like to do a little stage setting so we're all kind of on a common base plane. Back in 2015, in response to ever-increasing demolitions of single-family homes in Portland, the United Neighborhoods for Reform, a grassroots group, published a resolution signed onto by some 43 neighborhood associations advocating proposals to rein in demolitions. Oops, apologies. Yes, sorry. Okay. One of the key proposals in that UNR resolution was that the city change the zoning for better compatibility of new infill in our established neighborhoods. Thank you, Nore. A response to the McMansionization in neighborhoods of otherwise modest, affordable homes. The result was the creation of the Residential Infill Project, undertaken at the City Council's request by the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. In June of this year, the project's preliminary proposals were released for community discussion, and those proposals have proved to be very controversial. Of the 7 proposals, the first 3 relating to compatibility of infill have generated some positive reactions for their general direction in terms of limiting height, massing, and setbacks of new construction. But they've also raised concerns that they don't recognize the broad array of single-family neighborhood types across our city. The last 4 project proposals relate to ways to extend multifamily housing more broadly in what are now single-family zones. These last 4 have been the most controversial. But it is the compatibility issue, rather than the upzoning issue, that brings us here tonight. Why is that? Let me answer with some statistics. First, in Portland, we have 145,000 single-family houses. That translates into roughly 145,000 families, broadly defined, maybe including 300,000 or more of our residents. For a great many of those families, their home represents their life savings and their future retirement income. Needless to say, many of those folks are worried about what is happening in their neighborhoods and the potential impacts of poorly planned construction across the street or next door. But change is coming, regardless of whether the last 4 provisions of the RIP project are enacted by the City Council. Why? Because a large percentage of single-family houses in Portland already sit on land zoned for higher density. Does anyone want to guess at how many of the 145,000 that applies to? Any ideas? Somebody, just throw out a number. Huh? 40%, that's pretty high. But how many thousand? Come up with the 1,000 number. Well, it's 40,000. 40,000. I was expecting somebody to say 5,000 or anyway, 40,000. That comes about in 2 parts. 19,000 of those are actually sitting on land zoned for higher density. So that would be a house sitting in, let's say, an RH zone. RH can have 80 units in a building, but there's 1,000 or more single-family houses in RH zones. We also have RX, R1, R2, R2.5, where we have houses that sit on larger lots than what a single-family house could normally be built on. The other category is in single-family zones, every house on a corner by right, every lot on a corner by right can be built out as a duplex. It's hard to count that number, but we think it's about 17 to 20%. So of the other 120,000 houses, maybe 20,000, 22,000 are corners. And you say, well, that seems like a high number for corners. We've measured it in Irvington. It's 25% of our houses in Irvington. So it really is a big number. So roughly 40,000. That may not be enough, according to some people, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Aside from whatever new things are going to happen, we know we're going to have infill construction. It's going to be happening, and we believe that the community has a right to say how that infill construction will fit into its surroundings and impact its neighbors. We already know that what an unrestricted marketplace is producing, and what we are seeing in many parts of the city just doesn't fit. Equally alarming, it isn't producing remotely affordable housing. We have essentially the worst of all possible worlds. So tonight we're going to focus on compatibility and lessons to be learned from around the country. Our hope is to influence the discussion that will be happening at City Council in the next month or two on the final recommendations of the residential infill project, which were actually released to the public this evening, correct? Yes. The schedule of future hearings and votes is shown in your event program, and we hope that your voices will be heard during those hearings leading up to a council vote in December. And one of the things that hopefully will come out of this discussion is that when you go to make your point of view heard at City Council, you will be able to speak some of the lingo of infill design compatibility. So we have invited Nore Winter of Winter & Associates to speak to us tonight about his experiences around the country dealing with infill compatibility. He's an urban designer and planner with more than 30 years experience nationwide. His work includes recommended context-sensitive zoning codes and many urban design plans. Most interesting, like right now, his projects have included compatibility zoning regulations adopted in Denver, Colorado, which, by the way, is growing faster than Portland. It's about the same size of a city, but it's also facing the exact same problems we are with affordability, compatibility, and then a similar project currently underway in Los Angeles, which, in case you weren't aware, is actually twice our population density. So they're already confronting huge density issues, and they have large single-family zones. I think my recall was 250 square miles of single-family zone. A residential zone, okay. Not all of that single family. To stimulate discussion about what Mr. Winter tells us about other cities' efforts, we've invited a response panel of local experts on the subject who've been deeply involved in our residential infill project. First of those is Morgan Tracy, a senior planner at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability and currently serving as the project manager for the residential infill project. I want to extend a special thanks to Mr. Tracy for being here tonight. Want to just raise your hand so people know who you are. You'll be up front here in just a moment. His job has not been an easy one as the head of the residential infill project, and I applaud his continuing engagement with the community on this subject. Then Sarah Canteen is a registered architect with over 20 years experience. She is an active volunteer with Restore Oregon and a resident of the Boise neighborhood, and she's a neighborhood representative on the residential infill project Stakeholder Advisory Committee. If you've heard the term RIPSAC, that's what the acronym actually stands for. Sarah is a member of that. And then we have Brandon Spencer-Hartle, a Historic Resource Program Manager with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, a position he took up in March of this year. Prior to that, he was Field Programs Manager for Restore Oregon, our statewide historic preservation organization. At the BPS, he's had many projects, but one of those is taking a lead role in exploring how to repurpose existing single-family homes for higher density living to accommodate some of these pressures that we're under. So we talked about question cards just a moment ago. I will pick that up in a moment. Somewhere around the halfway mark, we'll start collecting your question cards. So keep in mind as you're listening to Mr. Winter's presentation and also during the discussion up here, what questions that you would like to ask, and then the last half hour, 40 minutes or so of this event, we will be taking those questions. We'll be collecting your question cards, eliminating the duplicates, and trying to get down to the ones that we can address in the time we have available. So with that, thank you all for coming, and I'd like to bring Mr. Nore Winter up here.
Thank you, and good evening. I'm delighted to be here and to have a chance to perhaps share some of my experiences from across the country. Of course, coming to Portland is a bit like bringing coals to Newcastle, isn't it? This is certainly a city that's well known for its forward thinking in terms of urban planning and livability. And so some of the things I'll be sharing with you, you're going to say, oh, we've been there, done that, and that's fine. But I'm also hoping along the way to perhaps share a few ideas or at least give you some terminology that you might want to use as you forward your discussions about compatibility in residential neighborhoods. As was mentioned, we do a lot of work in this field around the country. And to start off, and I don't know if we can dim lights. Does anyone know the technology here? I bet it would help a lot if we can find someone who can do that. This is my frequent flyer strategy map. And I show it. You're working on the lights? Okay, great, thanks. I show it to sort of let you know that we've had the opportunity to learn from a lot of people in their communities across the country about what they love and how they value their neighborhoods and their cities at large, and how they can, in some ways, protect them while also continuing to assure that they're livable and viable and great places to be in the future. Every state is up there except North Dakota and Delaware have not had the wisdom yet to hire us, but maybe you can put in a good word along the way. I'm a bit of a geek in this respect, and this is not an inspirational, motivational talk. This is a techno talk, a TED talk maybe in a way, I don't know. So I hope that you'll bear with me with that, but from what I've heard, I think maybe that's what you're ready for, is you're ready for some ideas. I was toured around today. I've been talking with the planning committee over the past couple of weeks. I feel like I've been drinking from a fire hose. There's so much to learn, and in a way, at this stage of the game, I don't want to be confused by the facts. Maybe it'll help me naively, in some cases, say things that wouldn't be appropriate otherwise, but might stimulate an idea. So if you will bear with me along the way on that. These are some of the communities in which we have helped to develop design standards related to compatibility across the country. Various scales, from small hamlets to very large cities, of course. A lot of our work began in the historic preservation world, where we learned how to look at community character and how to define it and how to translate that into guidelines. And the way we use the term guidelines is they're generally more qualitative, more narrative, and they're usually used by a review board like a preservation commission, and many of you may have had some experience with that, and some of you I know live in historic districts. That's not what we're going to talk about tonight. But there was a discipline that came out of that increasingly people were saying, isn't there a way we can codify some of this while still providing enough flexibility and being responsive to context, but not having to always use a design review process? And so we had to think about that along the way and come up with some ideas about how to respond to that. Now, these are some of the frequently stated concerns as we've worked around the country that we hear from community residents. One is loss of community character, how to maintain that at a neighborhood level or at a citywide level. And I will say this presentation will become available and will be posted. So while you're welcome to take notes, don't worry, you'll get it all. Livability, certainly, and how established built neighborhoods contribute to livability, both in the social and cultural way and an economic way as well as environmentally. And also a sense of how we maintain a sense of connection with our heritage, which we often hear with new residents coming into neighborhoods, that they're wanting to feel a sense of connection with the history. Certainly in a sustainability standpoint, and all three legs of sustainability to be considered there. Respecting previous investments, those who maintained or rehabilitated neighborhoods, who created the value that's now making them attractive. And certainly in several of our communities, and certainly my home, I didn't tell you that, did I? Boulder, Colorado. So Boulder also loves to play in the planning world, if you haven't heard. And to some extent, I always say we're now victims of our own success. We've made our place so desirable that it's a real challenge now in terms of how to keep it livable and affordable and also make room for others while maintaining the character that we love. So you're not alone. Does that sound like you? Does that sound like, does this sound familiar? You're not alone. I don't know if that is any consolation or not in terms of how you might address the issues. Some of the themes that we hear are certainly accommodating increased density that we all need to do. We have a growing population worldwide, and certainly in this country. We have to figure out ways to house people. How do we do that relating to context? And I'll talk a lot about that this evening. But also balancing simplicity with a sufficient response to context. I sort of touched on that idea that design guidelines are one approach, and we know that's not the one that works, cannot work everywhere, which means considering the administrative requirements. What does it take to run a system that addresses community character in any form? And if we make it too prescriptive, we miss the opportunity for the great innovative new design that otherwise couldn't occur. And how we balance it with other community objectives. The need to provide affordable housing, the need to promote alternative modes of transportation, the need to minimize impacts on landfill and loss of building material that's already in place, a lot of environmental considerations. And in many cases, it's distinguishing increasing intensity from increasing density. And of course, those of you who have seen a McMansion go up know that in many cases, the number of people living there are fewer than the ones who were there before in the smaller cottage. So density and intensity are two different things that we need to talk about. So what are some of the tools used? And many of these are in your toolkit already, but maybe not combined the way they could be. There are a series of what we would call form standards, a building envelope or bulk plan I'll talk about. FAR, and that's not long distance seeing. That, of course, is the floor area ratio. The percentage of lot coverage, how building setbacks are handled, how height limits are shaped, how building mass might be articulated. What we've learned in some cases is you can hide a bigger box to some extent if you manipulate its form in a creative way. There's a limit, but you can do that to some extent. And then also, so what we might call frontage requirements. What's the character of the front yard? Is there a porch? How is the driveway treated? Things that happen in the front setback that affect our perception of the streetscape a lot. And then there are other design options that I'll get into in a little bit more later detail. In a simplistic level, think of this. The basic form standards that are the normal toolkit for zoning just deals with this top list and gets you the shape up above. And for many cases, that may be totally sufficient. That may be totally adequate for compatibility. But in other communities, there's another level that we would call design standards that go to a finer grain and might get into other variables that are important to a community. Now, what this means here is that one size doesn't fit all. There's some where just the first category will work, and some where that's not sufficient. And if we create a system that includes all of these variables for everyone, we've probably overdone it. And if we create a system that only deals with the top layer, we've probably missed some of the sensitive neighborhoods. I've already touched on balancing concerns about simplicity and flexibility. There are some other balancing acts, of course, and that is understanding the viewpoint of which side of the property line you're standing when you're looking at what your rights are and what your opportunities are. If you're the owner of that property, you want to maximize that. If you're the person next door, you're impacted by that, and we're all neighbors, and we need to understand and value that. And then, of course, also understanding the value of the community at large, as well as the value of the property and how they all work together. Looks like I may have some odd links here. I hope we don't have that problem too much. So let's talk about considering context. That's a big part, I think, of the discussion of if we are upset about what has happened or what might happen, how do we articulate, first of all, who we are, what it is we value about our neighborhood or about our community in a physical sense. There's certainly a lot of other cultural, social aspects we can talk about as well. But physically, how do we describe that? And there are different layers of considering context, if you will. There's the overall neighborhood at large, but within that, there might be sub-areas, sub-contexts, sometimes we call them typologies, that have distinctive development patterns and characteristics, the scale of the houses, the forms and materials, it might be the period in which they were constructed. Another layer may be the more immediate setting, the blocks that face you and that you are seen in perspective from your site. And then, of course, at the very fine-grained level, the abutting properties who most immediately see what's going on that site. So some things about defining context are visual, they're sensory. We do it out on the street. We look to see that there's a rhythm of house, side yard, house, side yard, house, side yard that establishes a scale for pedestrians walking down the street. Or perhaps the one-story scale of porches and eave lines, even though some porches project out, others are cut in, some are full width. The fact that there is a vocabulary of porches might be a defining feature for some neighborhoods. A consistency of front yard setbacks, or at least a narrow range of setbacks. As you begin to look at character, you can think about it in terms of what's the degree of consistency and or what's the degree of diversity, because in some cases, the eclectic character is, in fact, a part of the neighborhood. That said, even eclecticism in a neighborhood generally has limits. It has a range of scale or character or orientation to the street. There may be still fundamental features that are uniform, even in a very eclectic neighborhood. How do we begin to look at that? These are some samples of development patterns from our project in Los Angeles, and Jim talked about that in a moment. LA is in the midst of recreating its zoning code. The zoning code was written in 1947. They decided it was time for an update. It has been patched for years and years and years, but this is the major rewrite. It's a 5-year project. It's an enormous undertaking. We're 2.5 years into it. Our responsibility is the residential zones. And so I'm going to be sharing some of that along the way. That is work in progress, but I think there's some interesting things going on in it that might be worth looking at. But so part of it is making use of GIS data to understand development patterns. And there are lots of variables that can be mapped and then graphed to understand how consistent or diverse neighborhoods might be. So for example, looking at the distribution of lot sizes, this immediately in this one neighborhood, can you see 2 different character areas already? You know, this is an area that is very consistent in terms of lot size and relatively speaking in terms of lot coverage. Here we have a much wider diversity going on. So there are variables that even though it's on paper, you can begin to get a sense of where there may be diversity and where there may be consistency. Part of that has to do with recent change, of course. Other variables are where the floor area ratios are, and these higher ones, in some cases, are more recent infill projects in a generally uniform neighborhood in terms of floor area ratio within a certain range. The same thing in terms of looking at building size. Now this begins to give us signals about what's happening in terms of potential impacts, because even though we have a fairly consistent floor area ratio, we have a great range really in terms of building size. And that interaction between those two is one of the variables that we look at. This can all be consolidated into some descriptions of different typologies, if you will, so that even though there may be many, many neighborhoods that exist in the city, you might be able to boil it down to, I don't know, a half a dozen or a dozen different contexts, if you will, that have distinct characteristics. And so this is a poster summary of one group of typologies, the group A's in Los Angeles, and they have some distinctive similarities. One is most garages are at the back, there is no alley, and they're accessed by driveways. There's a certain scale, there's a lot of data that's associated with this. But that gives us a sense of that typology versus this one, which is also in Group A, but this is A3, gridded and uniform with alleys. And this changes a little bit about the way the street is addressed, of course, because of the alley configuration, and changes to some extent where secondary structures are located. So there's some interesting aspects of understanding these different typologies. But all of the Group A ones tend to be ones that are gridded, rectilinear, generally, in most cases, in flat topography situations. Another one, just a sample here real quickly, are the Group B typologies, where they have curvilinear streets, and in some cases garages are accessed immediately off of the driveway, but are perpendicularly oriented to the building form. So but now that doesn't mean that typology B should be a different zone with different standards necessarily, although in some cases that has been the result. But in some cases, we've said, these share the same fundamental physical characteristics as some of those gridded lots, and actually could be considered together in terms of zoning standards. So this analysis helps inform a variety of potential actions. Just real quickly, a couple of other examples of it. This is one we're working on in Houston, and Houston, doesn't have zoning. This is actually, but they do regulate everything that walks and talks like zoning in historic districts. So this is actually an analysis of floor area ratios and height limits for the historic districts in Houston. But it's also mapping the degree of consistency or the degree of variation that's going on in those neighborhoods at the same time. So it's not just looking for those that are highly similar, but also trying to understand those that are more diverse, and how would that affect your perception of compatibility? Are you more receptive to change and infill in an area that already is more eclectic, that already has more diversity in it, is something that we're looking at. And this kind of analysis can move on up to higher density situations. This is just a brief example out of an earlier project we did in Fort Lauderdale, where here we call them development patterns, and you can see this neighborhood has a mix of different scales of buildings, and the responses, therefore, might be very different. How do you use that kind of typology analysis? Well, it can be used in a variety of ways. One is you could actually set up different districts with standards respecting those different typologies. If the floor area ratio, if the lot sizes, if the setbacks are very distinctively different from type A to type B, then maybe that indicates that there's a different set of numbers, even though it might be the same variables, but they're calibrated differently for those different districts. You could use it to develop design guidelines, and we have, where instead of the code, instead of zoning standards, we're going to have some form of a discretionary review process. And that might be certainly for historic districts, but it also could be for other places that have a formal design review system of some type. Or in some cases, it's kicked in by a threshold. If you're building under the average FAR of the neighborhood, there's no design review level. If you exceed it, the design review level kicks in. So in some cases, there's a threshold that triggers the use of guidelines, and where otherwise they wouldn't be used. A related form of that is what we would call alternative compliance. And that is, there are the base standards in the zone. Say that's a base standard for the maximum height, for the maximum floor area, but also for the way a building needs to be oriented to the street, whether it has to have an entry facing the street, where the driveway might be located. Or there may even be some standards that require a certain degree of massing, and I'll show you a couple of examples of those in a minute. But what if I do have that better idea? And actually the result would be compatible, but it doesn't meet the numbers. Well, in some cases, we've set up a system of alternative compliance, which allows you to move into the design review track. You ask to do it because you've got a better idea. And so that's another way that you can use typologies to address guidelines, even where you might have a single zone district, but you could have different character areas in terms of the guidelines. And we also use them just to test the potential effects of things that we may be developing in terms of standards. To be certain, for example, with the typologies in Los Angeles, the type A, B, and C, some of those we're proposing will have the same dimensional standards, but we want to go back and test in each of those contexts to be certain that it's going to be work and that's going to work and be compatible. How might context translate into code? This is an example. Now, this is a set of work we did in historic districts for West Palm Beach, Florida. And I'll be showing you some other material from this later on. But what's going on here is these are different zone districts for the different historic districts. And these are the contexts for which different standards were written. So there were 5 sets of dimensional standards written for this range of historic districts. So it's not just custom tailoring down to every location, it's finding who shares the same features, how can we group and consolidate, and still custom tailor standards in a rational way, while not creating something that's unwieldy in terms of the way it's administered. Another part of the process of understanding context is learning from what's out on the street, what works and what doesn't work. And so these are some examples from the Los Angeles project, but we've done it in others where we've taken individual properties and analyzed them statistically. And doesn't matter really that you can't see the numbers, and maybe it's just as well. But some of the things, that we were seeing here, for example, is this building at least comes down in scale because of the one-story element on the front of the street, and has a sense of connection, even though it's a larger house. And what was interesting out of all of this analysis, and here's another example, is that in some cases the larger FAR building visually fit in better than some of the smaller FAR buildings that were just plain boxes. So the larger FAR building within limits that had some sense of scale, some variation in massing, a clear orientation to the street, using some of the conventional elements, not necessarily conventional styles, but conventional form elements, seemed to fit in better than some of the smaller FARs. So because in Los Angeles, they had been focusing on just cranking down the floor area ratio, feeling that to get to compatibility, they just had to keep reducing the permitted house size. And this was citywide, trying to come up with a single floor area ratio that would apply to, basically the single family zones are over 1/3 of the land area for the city of Los Angeles. And to try to come up with a single, well, right now, all of them are under a single floor area ratio, and everyone's screaming. And that's one of the reasons why we've been active there is because of that concern. So these case studies help us get cues about what does work and how might we use those in the toolkit of standards to address compatibility. Does that make sense? Another tool that people use, and you have to use it kind of with a certain amount of care, is visual preferencing. What do you like about these photographs? And just picking, I like this and I don't like that, is maybe somewhat informative, but what's more informative if people start talking about what works on any photograph rather than which one do you like or not like. What are the elements that you like regardless of style? And so this is just an example of a voting sheet from an activity in Houston where people are looking at houses and talking about which elements might fit into their neighborhood, and it has to do with material and form and scale and the way entrances and porches are addressed, a whole series of variables. That's more informative than just saying, I like it or I don't like it, and it helps inform the codification process. That can be brought forward in a series of visual preference modeling exercises. And so in this case, in an online survey, participants were asked which of these, particularly in terms of lot coverage, seem to be appropriate or compatible. They didn't see the statistics. This is what we knew was going on behind the scenes. But in terms of what people felt was going to fit in with their neighborhood was very informative in terms of trying to get a sense of what is the threshold of tolerance for larger new buildings and change of scale in the neighborhood. A similar example of how to do that is this one from a recent activity in Houston, where a variety of house models, this is the original house, and then you to visualize these alternatives and to think about how they fit into this particular context. And in fact, the way this exercise is being run, and it's an online survey happening now, there are a variety of different contexts. This one happens to be the one that is traditional in character, but 1- and 2-story mix. There are others that are all 2 stories. There are some that are all 1 story. And the same models are dropped into those different settings to see, is there a difference in the way you respond to compatibility based on the block character and its scale? Those are... I don't know, is this of interest to you? Is this something you want to hear about? Okay. Just checking. I could change the topic, I guess, if you it'd be a little difficult, but I could try. All right, so that's sort of how you look at context. Well, what do you do with that then? What are the tools that you might use to engineer something that might be compatible within that kind of a setting? So let's look at some of those basic tools. Number one is floor area ratio, the percentage of house size to lot size. And that is expressed or named different things, and it's calculated in different ways. But the idea is that basically that you are permitted this much square footage and you can stack it that way, or this way. And it's that ratio, that percentage of building to land area. Now, a key concept is in a neighborhood where you want to be able to have diversity and variety in building form, is that the permitted volume within which you could build, and here's a box, a building envelope, if you will. Now, how is that defined? That's defined by front and rear and side yard setbacks and the maximum height that's permitted. Now, it may not be formally called a permitted building envelope or bulk plane. It is a de facto envelope that you can't go past, except maybe, sometimes there's an encroachment provision for a window or something like that. But essentially, that's the concept. What's key is that the floor area ratio must be less than that box in order to get variety. Otherwise, all you do is get boxes. That's stating the obvious. But many times, the code permits filling the box. And no wonder people then scream. And when you start asking for people to manipulate or reduce size, there's a lot of pain. So one thing to first understand is what is permissible and how does that relate to that context that we've defined and understanding what the traditional FAR is, et cetera, and what the potential new FAR is and how they sync or not. Now, that's not to say that just keeping the historical FAR is essential to compatibility. There are ways to begin to manipulate it. Part of it is how you count floor area ratio, of course. One technique is to not count a detached structure. And so in the draft code for Los Angeles and in others we've worked on, a garage in here does count because, of course, it is contributing to the perceived mass of the building and therefore ought to be considered. On the other hand, it's much more desirable to have it located back here. How am I doing on time? How much more? 15 minutes. Okay, I think we'll be all right. I'm going to move fast through some of this stuff. There are exceptions to how you calculate FAR. So a certain amount of below grades, high volume spaces that are essentially 2 stories, but only have one floor often get counted as two floors, for example, and you're probably familiar with that. So here's the idea of the bulk plane in use, and but now many bulk planes are ones that slope in to push the mass in away from abutting neighbors. You're still allowed a substantial amount of square footage, but you must design within an envelope that is less intrusive on the sides. So that's a tool that is often used. And in some cases, that is designed to be in two steps. This one is one that actually requires a lower form to be in scale with the cottages that are a part of this particular context. Others flip that form. So we have basic height measurement techniques that are used, but often now what we're doing is introducing two heights. One is the maximum height of the wall plate or the side wall at the minimum setback line, because that's what the neighbors see, much more than the midpoint of a roof. And so those two different height measurements become essential. Another one is sidewall length. And in many, many, many of our single-family neighborhoods across the country, this maximum wall length is about 45 feet. And when a house starts getting longer than that, a new house starts feeling uncomfortable. You may not know that, you may not feel that, but that's part of what's going on. So in some cases now, there are requirements for wall offsets at a certain point. You have to jog in. That opens up backyards, lighten air a little bit, and provides some relief along that wall plane. So that's a technique that's being used to help disguise larger mass in a residential setting. And there are different techniques of using it in the code we did for Boulder. There are a variety of options of requiring that offset. And in some cases, we've also added it to the front, a requirement for articulation, if you will, for the front. The setback is interesting because in many neighborhoods now, there's actually a traditional range. It's not a single point. And averaging really gives you the wrong answer. Establishing a predominant range of setbacks is often more reflective of the traditional development pattern than a number that's been averaged. And this same kind of approach to building envelopes can apply to higher density kinds of building forms as well. Another tool that we're using, though, is this menu of options. This is still within the range of a standard development code, but to say, for example, you must have an entry facing the street or a clearly defined entrance, and here are a variety of ways of doing it, is a menu of choice within a code. The standard is you must have a clearly identified entry. You can choose from this list. If you don't see it on the list, then let's move over to the design review track. That can even be codified down to levels such as this. This is a draft of some standards we're working on for an area of Fort Worth. And here is a visual menu of building materials. And over here, I'm really sorry that I guess this projector and I just don't sync real well. These should be fairly sharp. This is a series of different form districts. So we've got however many there are here, 7 or 8 or 9 of them, with a listing of different kinds of materials and where they're permitted as a primary or a secondary material. And then this is the visual checklist of what those materials are. No, I don't have a focus button on it. No, and see, this is all in focus. It's somehow the resolution of these. I made the mistake of downsizing the resolution for file size, and it went farther than I thought it was. So I'll be certain that the one that's posted is the higher res one. So this is just an example of this alternative track. If I want to just get by and follow the standards, this is some we did for Durango, Colorado. You go right through here, you get your building permit. But if I have that alternative idea, there's an option that I can go and have design review by staff, and they can use guidelines and permit it. If they're not comfortable doing it, they can refer it to the appropriate advisory board. But again, that's a limited track for only those that want to initiate it. That relies on guidelines that are clearly illustrated. These are more narrative in character. They're not prescriptive standards, but they are identifying some of the particular kinds of variables that are going to be reviewed. Now, these standards can be mapped in a variety of ways. You can map them by neighborhood geographically, or you can do it by zone district. You can even limit it to certain thresholds of lot types by age or size, for example. Those are a variety of ways of doing that. So again, the numbers aren't important, but here's a table that summarizes all of the basic form-based standards related to these districts that were created in Durango, Colorado. So a lot of the numbers are the same, but there are a few numbers in here that change, and those are the ones that are very important to those neighborhoods. And that's what's important about this kind of a system of defining different standards. Similarly, a similar table here for one out of Fort Lauderdale. Now, the Los Angeles Code, what I want to show you here is where it's emerging. We're combining physical context, character, who we are today, with planning policy, where do we want to be tomorrow? And recognizing that some neighborhoods that are very intact, in fact, may say, you know, we're cool with having a lot of new development. And there may be others that have already changed quite a bit that have said, you know, we've had enough. And so the idea is to generate a range of flavors. It's not Baskin-Robbins 31. We're at 16 options right now, between those where we are going to accommodate change and some in the middle where there's a moderate response to change in terms of scale of development, to those that are more limited in change. And they are being rolled out in phases. While a lot of this sounds like something you really need to do all at one time, it's being implemented in a series of 3 steps. And I'm not going to go into the detail about it, but just to let you know that it's possible to add in some of these kinds of standards incrementally, but in a very logical way. We already touched on FAR. I'm going to skip that. What I want to get to is this. This is beginning to show you how these different envelopes are going to be used. There's one that's very permissive. There's one that nudges the mass of the house up front, because that's the tradition in this context of having 2-story buildings. This is one where the tradition is more 1-story in front, and this is addressing hillsides. And then there's a special condition that you can elect for that will require a detached garage as opposed to just incentivizing it. So within these 4 basic categories, there are then subcategories of different dimensional standards. This is what generates the 16 zone categories. And so within those, there are different variables in terms of lot coverage, in terms of floor area ratio, in terms of height limits, and how the encroachment plane is shaped. So each of those is tailored to slightly different conditions, part of it responding to physical context, and part of it responding to political decisions about how much change do we want to accommodate. So again, you don't need to look at the numbers, but to see that this is how, in a very systematic way, you can assemble a set of standards for a variety of different contexts. And then through the community planning process, determine which ones are best for each neighborhood. Another part of the tool, there are conservation districts. I'm not going to talk about that, but it is an added layer for those who really want to get into a finer grain set of standards than is practical in the basic form-based standards. Another key part of it, though, is to test, as I touched on earlier. And so, for example, even though the code is still draft, although phase 1 is already past the Planning Commission and is headed to City Council, phase 2 implementation pieces have been scheduled in November for Planning Commission. The big pieces are still a couple of years out in terms of implementation in LA. But here's an example of testing. We took several projects that have been approved in the historic districts and ran them through our models of what the new restrictions would be to see how they would fit. This one would have to clip a little bit here. And what was interesting is that this one actually had a much larger floor area ratio than what is permitted citywide right now in Los Angeles, and yet was quite acceptable in this kind of a context. We also took award winners from the Los Angeles American Institute of Architects and ran them through the test. So this was an award winner, and it would have had to change its design a little bit to fit within the envelope. So the point was, it's not dictating style. it still allows a wide variety of artistic expression. And for some of you, maybe that's not enough, but that's what it's doing there. So that's a sort of a quick overview of things that we've been doing across the country related to how you think about who you are, and then how you might match that up with policy about where you should go as a neighborhood, and how you might create within a reasonable system some choice, and using some tools that are combined to balance form and mass and scale, and to achieve compatibility at a certain level. Real quickly, I'm going to skip through this material. This is the part of the Denver Code. Denver has been very successful, too much so, and to some extent. In the single-family zones, the code has worked pretty well. It still allows probably bigger houses than some people would like, and there is some talk about wanting to fine-tune the numbers in the single-family zones, but these are some recent ones built under the code that we worked on. What's really interesting is now the multifamily are separate zones in Denver, and so duplex and up are not allowed in the single-family zone. They're in their own zones, and typically are ones that are transitional. So this is single family, these are two and multifamily zones, and then heading over into commercial corridors. So normally there's that kind of a transition in scale as you get closer to the commercial corridors. And this is where duplexes have begun to happen, and some of the same issues of driveways diving down, things that were not anticipated in the code at the time, are beginning to occur. Now, this is disruptive in scale, but those areas were zoned that way. It was known that that was the scale that was going to happen. Now, it's still a shock to people who are in those places, but it's a distinction between that and what's happened in the single-family zone districts. And what's particularly interesting, so you hear just some other examples of that. So perhaps it's not a good reassurance to let you know that others are dealing with some of the same issues. Here was the lesson of an unexpected, unintended consequence. The Denver Code identifies certain building forms that are permitted, and a row house form was identified as being permitted. And somehow the code didn't say you can't rotate that 90 degrees and Xerox it and duplicate it and run a walkway down the middle and call them townhouses. This is what we call six-packs. But normally they can have 6 to 8 units on, usually it takes 2 lots to do that. But that's what they're doing. And so there's now discussion of going back in and changing the code to eliminate this. It's been powerfully successful, of course, and it is providing housing. There's no question of that. But these are in neighborhoods that were expected to see townhouses as their multifamily building type. So that's a really interesting lesson there. I just really wanted to quickly show you in the Boulder example, these are recent infill houses. Pretty much in scale, in character. The system there's been working well. The form, the envelope, et cetera, has been producing houses that work well. We have a solar access ordinance that also shapes the form a little bit. The two work in concert, and there really haven't been any issues with it. And similarly in Fort Collins, where we did a similar system, you see the range of style that's happening, some contemporary, some more traditional, but generally speaking, relatively in scale with the traditional development patterns of the area. So that's the whirlwind overview, and I hope it wasn't too geeky. And there may be questions, but I think we'll hear those later on.